Pleasure is a classic because its lasting image will never leave your bones.
Yeah. Pleasure is a classic because it's a beautiful play about what it's like to actually have a body.
Three Women is a classic because even if you haven't had any of these experiences, you can relate to the deep, dark, loving nuance of all of these humans.
Three Women is a classic because Sylvia Plath is a freaking genius, man.
Yeah.
It's just so good.
Oof.
This is our history. This is our legacy.
Hello, and welcome to This is a Classic, the Expand the Canon Theater Podcast. We're your hosts.
Sky Pagan, she, her pronouns, and a curator for Expand the Canon.
And me, Emily Lyon, she, her, artistic director and a curator for Expand the Canon. And we're here to introduce you to some plays by women that are classics.
Expand the Canon is a program of Hedgepig Ensemble, a Brooklyn-based company that reimagines the classics, creating a legacy of storytelling with gender equity at its core.
Today, we're getting into Pleasure by Rachilde and Three Women by Sylvia Plath. A quick note for today's episode, we will be discussing the topics of suicide, death, sexual assault, and miscarriage. So if any of those topics are sensitive, take care of yourself. If you go to expandthecanon.com, and you should, you'll find this pitch for Pleasure.
If you're looking for a play that reveals how the pursuit of sensuality can both liberate and ensnare, then Rachilde's Pleasure is the two-hander of your dreams. An intimate, delicate, and emotionally charged conversation between two young lovers, Pleasure offers feminist undertones with a dangerous and erotic edge. The play's themes of sexual politics, youthful desire, and the consequences of indulgence are as timely today as they were in its origins in the Belle Époque. Fans of Sarah Kane, Sam Shepard, and Edith Wharton alike will delight in its dark twists and lush poetry, making this a standout choice for a contemporary or a classical season. Ooh.
Yeah.
So good. So spooky.
Yes. Spooky pleasure.
Indeed, spooky pleasure. So we'll talk more about the spooky pleasure in a second, but we'll also be talking about Three Women. So since you're already on expandthecanon.com, you'll find this pitch written there too.
If you're looking for an achingly lyrical play probing the complex beauty and pain of pregnancy, consider this dramatic poem that brings Sylvia Plath's raw emotionality to the stage. Interweaving three contrasting perspectives, this piece wrestles with childbirth, loss, and motherhood as perceived by a trio of women. One welcomes a wished-for and beloved child, another comes to terms with a miscarriage, the third, too young for motherhood, gives her child up for adoption. The resulting chorus paints a sharp and unflinching portrait of having or losing a child. Three Women is a daring piece to engage a community in conversation around the choices and agency of reproductive rights, arcing towards glimmers of hope and healing.
So two really poetic, beautiful, and sensual pieces we have here today. I think this is a really interesting pairing. These are both definitely leaning more towards the poetic edge of our offerings this year. Three Women, obviously, more so than Pleasure, because Three Women is quite literally a dramatic poem. But I think for our lyrical language heads out there, this is your episode.
Oh, yeah.
These are some really lush and gorgeous plays. And I think have some really interesting thematic resonances as well. Perhaps not necessarily in obvious ways, but I think both of these plays are really dealing with bodily autonomy from two very different perspectives, but in very tangible and raw ways. Obviously, Rachilde's is much more about the idea of pleasure and is much more about sort of youthfulness, what it is to be discovering your sensuality. Whereas Three Women is much more grounded and sort of a very
Kind of the next step.
kind of the next step, yeah. And also pregnancy as a very physical experience, I think.
Yeah, and both thinking about in very beautiful and poetic ways, a woman's experience of the journey through sexuality in a really sort of concrete, specific, and yet abstract and poetic way. So Sylvia Plath has these three different looks at the many, many feelings you can have around being pregnant, having a child, losing a child, or losing a pregnancy, and all of the different ways into that. But pleasure is really looking at like pleasure as a physical experience. Like they're both really delving into the intricacies and nuances of these physical experiences of having a body in this world.
Yeah.
Especially from a femme point of view, but not just that.
Yeah, I think you're really getting to that thing there of like, these are very like physically grounded plays in a way that like is interesting also given how poetic they are. I think that's something that you don't necessarily come across that often of like, these are both plays that are about what it is to have a body. It isn't, they're about like what it is to feel things and touch things and be touched and have your body do weird things that you don't understand. And like that's like a very like human subject. And also one that like is hard to talk about because bodies are weird and intimate. And I think these plays do it in such like a grounded and also beautiful way.
And they both clarify like how our bodies are access to this huge realm of feeling as well. So bodies as conduit.
Yeah. Bodies as conduit for sure. And also like the difficult, I think it is like in a meta theatrical way, also like both of these plays are about the sort of like difficulty of having that conversation about trying to convey a bodily experience, and how hard that is to talk about and how hard it is to sort of bridge that gap and explain a very like intimate personal thing, which is like what it is that is going on in your insides.
Which makes sense that you end up reaching for poetry to do it.
Yeah, oh, totally. Absolutely.
Legacy.
Tell us more about Pleasure, Sky, as a play and where it goes.
Yeah, absolutely. This is going to be interesting, not to be also meta theatrical about this podcast, but like Emily and I were sort of talking about like, oh, usually this is the bit where we sort of summarize these plays. And I think this is one of those scenarios where like neither of these plays are really like plot focused.
Yeah.
So curious to hear what comes out of my mouth right now, but just to sort of like ground you at the sort of reality of this play. This is a two-hander. The two characters are named he and she. She is 14 years old and he is 15 years old, and they are basically like two kids in love. And the whole play takes place in kind of idyllic, pastoral summer forest glade. And there's all this like beautiful imagery about nature and the breeze and the smells of the flowers around them and the sounds of the leaves and the summer day and like what it feels like to be lying in grass in the summertime, and like all of that really grounds you. I think that's like a very sensory experience that we all can relate to, and that sort of like hot sticky day feeling,
being so present with each other and the world.
Yeah, also like grounding us very quickly in the physical sensation that is like really key to this play. There's something very sensual about grass under your feet and warm breeze on your skin. Those are all like very physical sensations, and that's, I think, what is so smart about the setting of this piece. Also importantly, in this setting, there is this like beautiful pool, like a pond that is in the setting as well, that these two characters are lazing in the grass around. And really what this play is like a stolen moment between two teenagers lying in the grass, hiding from your parents, like just talking.
And flirting.
Like a very like youthful experience. You know, these are young teenagers who are going through puberty and like changes in their bodies and changes in their hormones and their experience. It's like a curiosity, like a naive curiosity that they're both experiencing of like, I feel this thing. Do you feel this thing? Or like, I've had these thoughts. Do you have these thoughts? And so she proposes basically a game where she's like, let's each name things that give us pleasure and things that give us pain.
I think she's going to name things that give her pain. He should name things that give him pleasure.
Yes.
Yeah.
Something like that. Yeah.
They each have their own sort of like take on the game.
Yes. But it's all very sensual things they're describing. The feeling of satin sheets. And he describes like running his finger along the tip of a razor blade, the idea of the possibility of pain, of like never quite cutting yourself, but like seeing how close you can get before you actually do. And the precipitant danger of that being, he doesn't say erotic, but like the undertones are there. That sort of craving of sensations and new sensations. So it starts as this game of like, I'll name things that are pleasurable and I'll name things that are painful. And they quickly sort of realize that like, oh, these lines between pleasure and pain are perhaps blurry. That titillating danger. And for her, describing like the feeling of satin sheets under her hands. And then, really nice satin, sometimes like your finger catches on the little unevenness in the thread. And there's like a roughness there that can be almost painful sometimes. And her talking about that, like the pleasure of the smoothness of that fabric. And then also like the catch on your hand and that unexpected roughness and how that can be pleasurable too. And so really, again, getting at that sort of like these sensorial body experiences, also the intimacy of getting to share that with another person, that sort of underlying feeling of curiosity and need and desire and fear and all those things that you don't quite have the words to say, as opposed to just like, it feels nice and so I'm going to keep doing it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally. And also it's so interesting that the gendered lens that gets on it, right? Like if she's listing everything that's ever hurt her, and so many of those things begin in softness or start out rough and end in softness, right? That all the things that gave him pleasure are these like rough and intense things. It's a really interesting picture of how that these fine lines are personally blurry, but also blurry in gender context, and that line between pleasure and pain for both of them is quite thin.
Yeah, absolutely. A thing I love about this play is it's all about sort of undertones. There is one moment of physical intimacy between these two characters where they share a kiss, but it is specifically directed to be like a very chaste kiss of like, these are kids and you're perhaps still like not quite ready to explore what that means fully with another person. But what you can do is say like, these are the things I think about, and do you think about them too?
And the push and pull of wanting someone close, but also wanting to keep your boundaries. Yeah.
Yes.
And how that's both pleasurable and painful. Yeah, totally.
Yes. So this conversation kind of goes, and it gets like, this game sort of evolves, or they're just, sort of sharing openly, like, do you think about me? Yes, I think about you. The girl starts talking about things one of the things that gives her pleasure is the smell of hyacinths, and how she like sort of identifies with that smell. And she has this wonderful line where she's like, if you were to smell my heart would smell like hyacinths. I also love that idea of like identifying with a physical sensation like that, where you're just like, oh, like I feel this thing so deeply, and that it is who I am. And there's like this, and then he responds with this sort of like very romantic sort of declaration where he's like, can I smell your heart?
Yeah.
And then to your point, it gets, of the sort of like push and pull of boundaries, is she's sort of like flustered by that. And she's like, no, like, I don't know that I want you that close physically. And like, I don't know that I want that. And so it's like that sort of thing of like, again, wanting someone, wanting closeness, wanting intimacy, but like, not quite sure where the boundaries are yet. And so, you try something and that's too far. And so you take a step back. So she says, no, you can't smell my heart. And she gets sort of embarrassed. And then he sort of recovers from that and says, well, instead, can I drink your reflection? If you lean over the face of this pool of water that we're sitting by and look down at your reflection, I can like get a cup of water, like you cup my hands and dip my hands into your reflection and get a drink of your heart that way.
And you will be inside me forever, is the line.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yep. Which again is just like so hormonal.
Yes.
It's like, oh my God, these kids have no idea what to do with these feelings right now. And also a thing I love of just like, when you're like 15 and like falling for somebody for the first time and you're just like, oh, I want to drink your heart. It's like so like
both creepy
cliche.
And lovely and sweet and kind of gross. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, no, like absolutely chaotic. Like fellas don't do that. But like also that sort of Romeo and Juliet thing where you're just like, I will be with you forever. I want to be as close to you as possible. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So she leans over the pool and he like dips his hands in the water and like cups some water and drinks it and like says like, this is like a new kind of intimacy of we can be close together in this way. There are many ways to experience intimacy with another person. And I think we very reductively as a culture like talk about sex and like particular kinds of sex acts as like the only way to be intimate with someone. And like, I think it is really good for everybody to expand your boundaries in terms of what intimacy can look like, because that makes you be a better person and better able to navigate your own boundaries and stuff like that. But I digress. Sorry, sex educator hat off.
An important hat.
Important hat. So he drinks her reflection and he starts like waxing poetic.
That it was delicious.
And he loves her, like all these things. And she cries out and faints, basically. And the boy's horrified, he rushes over and he's worried about her and doesn't understand. But as they run away, we see what it was that she screamed about. And floating to the surface of the pool is the body of a dead woman.
Yeah, it's quite sweet. She sees it and she says, carry me away without looking in the water. And so she's almost protecting him from it.
Yeah.
But yeah, the stage direction of it looks like a dead woman whose white teeth shine in her open mouth under the clear water. Ugh.
Yeah. I sort of picture there's like the famous portrait painting of Ophelia in the reeds. Like it's very that. And there's something, I remember us talking about this ending when we first read this play. Because I think maybe it was you, Emily. We're like, what do we make of that?
Very possibly.
And I find it sort of hard to articulate exactly why I feel like I understand that ending. But there is something to me about like this play so much is about the sort of like dichotomies of pleasure and pain, of like what it is to be youthful, what it is to grow up, what it is to be alive, that there's something about being reminded of death that feels like a sort of yin and yang.
It's another way of having a body,
Yeah, and it's also like grounding it in the reality of like you have all these like romantic sensual experiences and then you end up dead. And there's something very haunting also about like a dead woman somehow getting at the sort of undertones, specifically for like femme people. Like pleasure can be dangerous. And like, I mean, it can be for everybody, but like there is like a heightened danger when it comes to having a femme presenting body. Those boundaries become important because they are what protects you and keeps you physically safe in a way that like I think a lot of masc people don't necessarily have the same experience of. And so I think that also resonates with me of like the reminder of the underlying danger that is here. And that is not to say that that necessarily indicates that like the woman in the pool.
Yeah, we don't know her story at all, but yeah.
We don't know her story. That's not necessarily prescribing anything, but I think there is a reality. I appreciate that the danger is there.
Well, even in the way that he initiates that like drinking bit, he says, listen, I know how to possess you whether you want it or not.
Yeah.
You will lean over the pool and look at yourself, and then you will give me water from your reflection. Like it starts with what could be such a violent way of ending that phrase, but it feels like a tie back to the danger that he presents in a way.
Yeah.
Or could represent.
Yeah. I do not think these characters are necessarily like acting inappropriately in this play, but I do think there is like, to Emily's point, the sort of like underlying realities of their circumstances are different. The genderedness of it, the world will make them experience it differently. And I think that comes out in sort of mostly innocent ways in this piece. Of male pleasure being overly consuming of female pleasure is one we've seen reflected many, many times. Like I said, this is a play about undertones, and those undertones of gendered danger are very present, as much as the sort of like sweetness and intimacy is also present.
History.
Should we dive into talking a little bit about the amazing writer that produced this fascinating poetic deep dive?
Absolutely. Let's talk about Rachilde. Rachilde is cool. She's cool.
And
that's it. That's all I have to say. Okay. Rachilde is French. She was born in 1860 in rural France. Her birth name was Marguerite Emery. She got into writing at a young age. Themes of rebellion will be present throughout this entire biography. But I think there was, if we're talking about the 1800s, the idea of like a woman trying to be a writer was like an act of rebellion.
Yeah.
So she started with novels, actually. She wrote her first novel when she was 16. No big deal.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting how many of our writers began writing early.
I know, so precocious. Her debut novel was published when she was 16. It was called Monsieur de la Novité. And she began experimenting with plays pretty early, though, as well. A big shift for her, though, came with a move to Paris, and she started working in the literary criticism sphere. She became a key figure at this like heavily influential literary journal called the Mercure de France, where she wielded like significant editorial power. So like she starts creating this like reputation for herself as both this literary critic and also notably this champion of like kind of controversial writers. So again, themes of rebellion.
You change the canon, you know? Go for it.
Hell yeah. This started being reflected in her writing and also the way she lived her life in terms of her explorations pretty blatantly of desire, gender fluidity, and like societal taboos of like really being this sort of like transgressive figure. And around this time is when she adopted the pseudonym Rachilde, which was a male name. And that was a form of subversion. And part of that was to do with writing. If she thought, you know, her books would be better received if they were perceived to be written by a man.
The George Sand of it all. Yeah.
Exactly. But part of that was also to do with gender subversion in her own life. You know, she was known for dressing in quote unquote masculine clothing, playing with that gender fluidity. In a lot of her writing, she is reversing gender roles, like female characteristics that are quote unquote male and vice versa. And just like really like playing with that idea of like what gender looks like, way ahead of her time in that way. She kind of subverted the idea of feminism, but I think it more stemmed from her belief that it was too narrowly focused. Feminism at that point felt too binary to her. You're trying to subvert women's role with making it men's role, but like that is inherently binary in a way that didn't jive with her personal views. So she felt that true liberation would not come from seeking equality with men, but from breaking down the entire structure of gender norms. She thought like fluidity of identity was really important. And that's not to say that her works are indifferent to the plight of women or that she isn't like very obviously like writing about, talking about quote unquote women's issues and ideas of bodily autonomy for women and oppressive patriarchal forces. But she does like have a more individualistic approach to that.
It's about gender expansion.
Exactly, yes. Like I said, she was known for wearing quote unquote masculine clothing. This was during the time of literary salons where she was like famous for carrying a cane with a skull handle. And she would say things that like she had been born a boy but assigned the wrong sex. I think something we've talked about in this podcast before is like we are hesitant to ascribe
terms that they wouldn't have used. Yeah.
Correct. Just because like we don't want to assume something, but like
that's a big ol' hint. Yeah.
Yeah, there's definitely some gender play happening there. And also she was like a very theatrical, loud persona.
Fierce.
She also, like I said, was like a really key figure in the literary sphere. So like becoming this champion of writers who were talking about gender roles and sexuality and all of that and morality and like censorship. She wasn't just writing it, but she was really like championing those works in those spheres as well. In the late 1880s, this is the era of Oscar Wilde and the salons and the Moulin Rouge. And so like is very much living in a time period that is starting to explore with these ideas. But she was like way out in the front. And, you know, this is reflected across her entire career. That said, she was like very influential during this time, but like was sort of forgotten about for the remainder of the 1900s.
If I had a nickel.
I know, right? As people were sort of starting like the revival of like women and gender studies and second and third wave feminism, people were starting to look back and study works in a more holistic way. The canon was being expanded. And this led to, you know, scholars discovering her work more and being like, oh my God, who is this person? This person was amazing. This is so ahead of her time. Yeah. But really exciting, increasingly like feminist and queer scholars have really unearthed her work. And particularly, I think these conversations around gender fluidity. You know, we've said this before, but like, particularly like in queer history, there's like this perception of like, oh, and gay people were invented in the 1960s with the Stonewall Inn,
yep.
As opposed to like this idea of queerness having existed for as long as there's been human experience. Yeah. And her legacy is really a key part of that. I find it very moving, like as a queer person, to get to see this legacy of questioning gender norms and binary gender in such an overt way. That writing having such like a resonance across time periods is like why we do this work and why this scholarly research is really important as well. And I do want to just close out with one quote from Pleasure that I think really got to this play's resonance with me personally. And this is something that she says. These are things we will never understand because our parents won't tell us. which I find just like lovely and tongue-in-cheek, and also like really gets to the sort of, like I said, the undertones of this, of be honest with your children and teach people to understand their bodies and their sexuality, and we will all be a lot safer and happier.
Legacy.
So speaking of being honest about our bodies and our sexualities.
And parents.
And parents, oh my God. Emily, do you want to tell us a little bit about our second play, Three Women?
Absolutely. As you mentioned, it is a little bit hard to summarize the plot of this. There are three women, shocking, and they each kind of go through a journey that is almost like braided together like different strands.
It's a lovely imagery.
As I was kind of making notes for myself, I was finding that because it is so poetic, and I think poetry describes something that is so hard to put into prose. If poetry is needed, one hopes that it's harder and longer to put something into prose. So I just found myself grabbing snatches of her turns of phrase. But just to kind of help us get a sense of the slaloming of these different voices, their first, second, and third voice, and they're all three very different women. The first voice kicks off the play. She's very pregnant and, quote, slow as the world. She's really excited about the baby that she is going to have, but is understandably nervous. She's very attuned with the fact that, yes, pregnancy and birth is very natural. This all happens in cycles. But hey, I would be afraid too if I was popping a whole human out of my body. So I get it. Then we meet second voice, who is a secretary in an office, and she's at work when she discovers, quote, the small red seep. Yeah, right? The beginning of what could be a miscarriage at work, and around her all these men seem so flat that the cogs of the capitalist world keep swirling around her as she goes through this like deeply poignant, sad experience. And then we meet our third voice, who is a student. It's less clear when we're meeting her exactly, but she begins by recalling the moment she knew that she was pregnant. And very much unlike the first voice, she isn't ready. She is not ready to be pregnant, to have a child. And it's interesting. There are, I think, a couple interpretations of her experience becoming pregnant. I will admit, and there is probably some projecting on my part, that when I read it, I interpreted it as a product of perhaps a sexual assault. There's some very like kind of aggressive phrasing, but it's never specifically described as that. So she describes her mate as a great swan with a terrible look, whose eye had a black meaning. So
That's so evocative.
right? Again, like I had to just use the poetry sometimes rather than being like, so she kind of says the thing about a swan. Like, just trust me, it's faster if I use her words. But yeah, I think there's a dark underbelly to the experience, whether or not it may have been consensual, it may not have been. But anyway, this young student is not ready to be pregnant, and yet here she is. So we keep following all three threads of these experiences. So second voice is coming home from the office, like really feeling this sense of emptiness within her. She so clearly wanted to be pregnant and wanted to have a child. She says, I have tried and tried. I have stitched life into me like a rare organ. And we flip back to first voice, who is, quote, a seed about to break. She's feeling these inescapable tidal waves of contractions, like the birth is beginning. Meanwhile, third voice, our student, also her pregnancy too has developed. And one of my favorite lines is she calls herself a mountain now among mountainy women. So she's in the doctor's office. So the doctors are all swirling around her and is very aware of the presence and possibility of harm. And she wonders, what if two lives leaked between my thighs? And in fact, even goes as far to muse, I should have murdered this, which murders me. But I appreciate the range of experiences that she's really touching on. Our first voice does give birth. It is painful, but it happens. She accomplishes a work. And I love that Sylvia Plath is acknowledging how much pain there is in childbirth and in mothering. And yet, conversely, again, we flip back to second voice, who is deep in a depression and guilt around her miscarriage, the pain of not mothering, right? And the red seep has officially become a miscarriage. She says, I make a death. But again, as we slalom back and forth between these experiences, first voice gets to hold her new baby boy. She loves him. She doesn't know what to do with all of this love that's now in her heart. Second voice, her miscarriage is over. She feels a lack and chooses to kind of go about life by throwing herself into the minutia, sewing buttons and holes in socks and taking care of all the bits of life. She says, I shall be a heroine of the peripheral.
Definitely haven't coped by doing that before in my life.
No, what do you mean? That's always like when my house is cleanest, is when I have other things that I should be doing.
Oh, yeah.
Oh God.
Yep.
Third voice gives birth to a child, a daughter, who is screaming and red and furious. So they've all kind of, their experiences have come to a head, sometimes literally, a physical baby head. I don't know, that's weird. Never mind. But yeah, first voice gets to look over this NICU ward, looking at all the babies of how they are the same. They are nothing. They are newness. They are possibility. And yet how, again, in this sort of physical sense, her son cries out and she becomes a river of milk. Second voice is adjusting to her new reality and, is told that she's a statistic, that this isn't that weird. She is, quote, 1 in 5, something like that. I am not hopeless. And pretends everything is fine. She's, quote, deferring to reality, the incalculable malice of the everyday. Third voice, our student basically escapes from the hospital. She packs up all her things, quote, the clothes of a fat woman I do not know, and leaves her baby behind. We next see her at her graduation wearing her cap and gown and choosing to go towards healing and pushing away the memories of her birth and her daughter. First voice is already becoming a protective mother, meditating on her son's normality, hoping that she can shield him from all the harm of the world. She says, I do not want him to be exceptional. I want him to be common, to love me as I love him, and to marry what he wants and where he will, which I love.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
So that's sort of her closing. Third voice ends in the throes of summer, unattached and grateful. The swans are gone, she says. And yet she wonders, what is that bird that cries with such sorrow in its voice? I am young as ever, it says. What is it I miss? And then our final image is of second voice. Home, peaceful, with her partner. I find myself again. I am no shadow, she says. And we end with an image of hope. Second voice says, the little grasses crack through the stone, and they are green with life.
Sylvia Plath is such a beautiful poet.
Yeah. She's just weaving these 3 very distinct experiences with all kinds of nuance, pain, joy, comfort, hope, and darkness so beautifully together. And I mean, it makes sense. It's really aligned with her own experience in so many ways.
History.
I think anybody who has read The Bell Jar will know, but I think she is clearly somebody who had a lot of feelings and somebody who's very articulate at sort of expressing what it feels like to feel those intense feelings. Just what it feels like in your body to grieve, or what it feels like in your body to be invaded by something, or what it feels like in your body to feel like your body is failing. And I think that's like, I think the beautiful poetry of this piece is like speaking to this sort of physical language that is of an interior experience that is like so hard to express, and she does it so well.
Yeah. I mean, she's known as being part of this confessional school of poetry. And that is what makes her famous, is her willingness, and much of her life, she kind of resisted being as raw and as specific and confessional, frankly, as she ends up being in sort of the last book of poetry she writes, which is titled Ariel. But yeah, it is that willingness to give herself over to that confession, that rawness that she's so famous for, that makes her name.
Yeah. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about this incredible writer?
Sure. And I'm sure there are many people that know way more about Sylvia Plath than I do. But for a quick overview, she was born in Boston in 1932. Both of her parents were professors. I love this. Well, her father starts out as a professor. And just fun fact, this is not important really, but he wrote a book about bumblebees, which I just sort of love. He unfortunately passed away quite early in her life. She was around 8 years old. And later in her life, around 1962, she would later keep bees with her husband. So bumblebees, just shout out.
I love that.
But yeah, her relationship to her father and his passing is a big theme in her work. And after he died, her mother became a professor at Boston University and taught secretarial studies. So Sylvia Plath published her first poem at 8 years old in the Boston Herald. So she's already at the jump, like a really precocious, generative. She's also like winning awards for paintings. She's very creative and into the arts.
I didn't know she was a visual artist.
Yeah, I mean, I will admit I didn't immediately come across any of her paintings, but
more of a private visual artist.
perhaps. I mean, she won awards for them. I'm sure they are accessible some way. But yeah, she very quickly, even like right after graduating high school, she was nationally published. She'd already written 50 short stories. So she was very intensely into the literature of it all. She went to Smith College on scholarship. And for those of you who read The Bell Jar or will read The Bell Jar, she won not only a fiction contest from this New York literary magazine, but also a guest editorship on the magazine, which is a plot point kicking off The Bell Jar. And again, she's part of this confessional school of poetry and writing. Interesting factoid, actually. So she only wrote one novel, The Bell Jar, which was published in her lifetime. It was published under a pseudonym, Victoria Lucas, because she was sort of dubious about the literary merit of it. And because it was kind of this confessional style of writing in a way, it's like, sort of thinly veiled autobiography. She used a fake name to protect some of the people she was portraying in it.
Yeah.
But after her death, it was published in her own name. And The Bell Jar also was inspired because she became very, very depressed during college and attempted suicide in her college years. And of course, if anybody listening to this is having any suicidal thoughts, please reach out to the mental health hotline. You can call or text 988. You are not alone in having these feelings. Sylvia Plath did too, but so do many people, and there is support. There are many more forms of support now than there were, thankfully.
Yes, absolutely.
She survived, obviously, thankfully. She won a Fulbright to study at Cambridge in the UK, which is where she met her fellow poet and future husband, Ted Hughes. They ended up moving back to the US, where Plath also became a teacher, a whole family of teachers. She taught at her alma mater, Smith College, for a while, but found it hard to balance teaching and writing and also being a mom and like having a life and complicated personal relationship.
Oh my gosh, can't imagine.
Right? Lots to do. So in 1960, they moved back to England. She published The Bell Jar and a book of poems, The Colossus, during her life, which received good reviews. She also had 2 kids, Frida and Nicholas, as well as, actually, it turns out, had a miscarriage. As you might, I don't want to say expect, but it's so clear in Three Women that that's an experience she has embodied. So Three Women is her only play that we know of. It's actually a radio play, and we did a stage reading of it.
Directed by Emily Lyon.
Oh, thanks. It was also staged professionally for the very first time in 2009. So there are ways to take this radio play into the physical realm, but you could also let it live as a radio play. It was first performed on the radio for the BBC in 1962 and later published in Winter Trees in 1971 after her passing. And now there is a lot of information out there about her suicide. She committed suicide in 1963 at age 30. And look up more about that if you like. But I think what is interesting is following her death is when that last series of poems that she was writing entitled Ariel got published. And really it is those poems, those highly confessional, raw poems that really made her name. So, you know, as a company and a project that is advocating for the legacies of these women being acknowledged and in the canon, it's interesting that she is one of our few writers whose name became bigger after she passed than she was during her lifetime. Of course, she was acknowledged both times, but she posthumously won a Pulitzer Prize in 1982 for her collected poems. So she is, I would argue, a part of the canon, but usually not a part of the theatrical canon.
I think the fact that Ariel did so well really speaks to, in terms of time period, this is the early 1960s. This is the Feminine Mystique was published the same year. And her poems really speak to what people had thought were individual private feelings. Yeah. And I think this is a time period where there was an outpouring of recognition by women and femme people of like, oh, this crazy that I feel isn't just mine. Like I am not alone in this thing. Many ways, like the Feminine Mystiques publishing in 1963 is like credited as being the start of second wave feminism because it like taught women that they were not alone for having these feelings. And I would argue that her poems were probably part of that as well, in the sense of like, she is so good at articulating what seem like feelings that you have in the dark alone. And I think that makes people feel so not alone. And that is why she is such a resonant author. And I think that is why this play resonated with us and with audiences so particularly, is like, it is articulating some like really dark private feelings. And by, you know, shining a light on those, you can make people realize that they're not broken for having those dark private feelings. And I think that is a true, beautiful gift that her work gives to so many people and has given for so many years. So really glad that we can continue to uplift that work.
Yeah. And there are so many more rabbit holes you can go down about, especially Ariel, and how the interpretation of her poetry is blended with often an interpretation of her life. There's a lot to dig into if you're curious. But just to speak to what Skye was just mentioning, one of my favorite quotes, even though I got to sneak a lot of them into my quote summary, one of my favorite quotes that really hits on that nuance and the dark feelings that we don't usually get to say, is a quote from Third Voice. I thought I could deny the consequence, but it was too late for that. It was too late, and the face went shaping itself with love as if I was ready. And just that sense of, it's still, no matter what, like, there is love for this thing that you're making, even if just the confluence of feelings within those three lines, the pain and the joy and the love and the heart and the challenge. And she said it so beautifully and so succinctly. She's just a really wonderful poet, and getting to dramatize those feelings and use those words is a challenge and a joy and a pleasure. Ha ha ha. See what I did there?
Oh, nice callback. Good job.
Thank you for joining us for our Three Women and Pleasure edition of This is a Classic, the Expand the Canon podcast. If you believe in the importance of expanding the canon, please give us a 5-star review and subscribe to this podcast.
And then you can hit the share button and forward it along to a friend, colleague, professor, or one of the other voices in your head.
To make it easy to find, read, and produce these plays, you can sign up and subscribe to expandthecanon.com.
For info on what's up next with us, you can follow us on Instagram,
At Hedgepig Ensemble Theater
Facebook,
/Hedgepig Ensemble Theater,
or you can join our mailing list at
hedgepigensemble.org.
You can also support this effort by buying some Expand the Canon swag,
To brag to your friends that you're changing the future of classics,
reading and producing these plays as classics,
and reaching out to us to partner on them.
or straight up donating to make all these efforts possible, which you can do from our website, expandthecanon.com.
Again, I'm Emily.
And I'm Sky.
Go be nice to your body.
Go be nice to yourself.
Yes.